Record. And we're recording. Okay, hi everyone. I'm very excited to be here today with two doctors who are both alumni from our program at CSU East Bay. So today we have DiShawn Givens, who's the Educational Equity Coordinator in Fremont Unified School District, and we have Shelllie Higuera, who is a counselor in the Office of Service for Students with Disabilities at Sacramento State University. And I had the immense honor of chairing both of their dissertations. So I'm just going to start by asking DiShawn and Shelllie, could you please provide just a quick overview of each of your dissertations?
Okay, who would like to start first? Dr. Shawn, or do you want me to go?
It doesn't matter to me.
Shelllie, go for it.
Okay. Well, my dissertation looked at disproportionality in K-12 education discipline practices, and then also looked at the disproportionality in the prison system for students of color with special needs. And so what I did is a qualitative case study, and I interviewed 6 formerly incarcerated people of color with special needs. 4 were African Americans and 2 were Latinos, and 2 were male African Americans, 2 female African Americans, and then 2 Latino male African Americans, or 2 Latinos. And so what I did is qualitative research, and I used the 3 critical frameworks: critical race theory, structural inequity theory, and then social reproduction. And so I was looking at the phenomenon of the pipeline to prison, and looking at the specific of what occurs in the environments of students that end up in prison later in life. And so I was looking at the early trauma, as well as also the socio-cultural and environmental factors. And so with those 3 frameworks, I interviewed my 6 participants. And like I said, it was a qualitative case study. And I researched 6 programs to recruit participants. And most of my participants I found was from Project Rebound in San Francisco State University. And so 5 of my participants came from that program. And one of the participants was from a personal contact that I knew. And so I did 3 data sources in my study. I had intake interviews, a questionnaire, and semi-structured interviews. And so what I did is I triangulated that data, and I looked at for consistencies and non-consistencies across the data to see where the data hangs and see where the common themes were of that research. And so through that, I did my initial coding, I did some axial coding, and then found the data. And so looking at the findings, or actually, are we getting into the findings yet, or just kind of like an overview of the dissertation at this point? Whoops, I can't hear you, Dr. Katie. The voice is, let me see, the microphone I don't think is working right now.
That's why I muted myself, because there was a little bit of noise. No, I think that's fine. And then we'll go into findings in just a second. So DiShawn, could you share?
Sure. So I was working in Hayward Unified and wanted to know kind of what was going on for African-American boys. I was seeing a lot of them being suspended, seeing a lot of different issues happening, but I was told that there was a program called College Bound Brotherhood, and I decided to do a case study on that to see what things were working. There were more kids coming to school, there were less kids getting suspended, but really just wanted to know why that was happening, because I knew the what. But I wanted to know why. And so I started looking at just some of the historical background of African Americans in school, and also in this country, looking at some of the cultural mismatches that we know exist within the education system, and a lot of the exclusionary practices that we see happening that is leading our boys from school to prison through the pipeline. So basically what I did was I did, again, qualitative research because it's my preference. I did a couple of focus groups, and then I did some interviews. I did a few focus groups with some of the boys in the program to kind of find out what they thought was causing these positive differences. And so I had groups of kiddos that talked to me a lot about what it was like to be in the program. In addition, I wanted to get very focused so that I could get a more rich discussion. So I spoke with one specific boy. I chose one boy. I interviewed his parent. I interviewed his teacher, and I interviewed his case manager within that program. And so that way we were able to get a deeper look, at least into one specific student for that case study research. And so pretty much that's it. I did a lot of coding with the data, pulled out some of the themes that kept coming up in order to try to gather what and how this program was changing the lives of the boys.
Yeah. So could you talk to some of those findings? What were some of the themes that came out for you, DiShawn?
So I was wondering kind of what they were doing, honestly. They said there's this program and these great things are going on, but I didn't know exactly what pieces of the program were making a change. And so we found out that they were meeting with parents on a consistent basis and supporting them. They were having college tours for the boys, and then there was case management. And so what they were getting out of those things was that they started to build relationships, not only with their peers, but with adults and adults in powerful places. And they started to gain an understanding of what it was like to be in college. And they were taught that they belonged in college. Like that was something that they should expect and look forward to. And so what we found was that they started seeing themselves as having futures beyond their high school experience, which was not always the case for their family members. And we saw that, their grades were going up. They were interacting with adults in more positive ways. And they even felt that it changed folks' perspectives on them. So not only were they seeing themselves differently, but other people were seeing them in different ways. And so that was kind of what we found. We also found that sometimes the boys were looking at other boys not in the program in the same ways that others had looked at them in the past. So they were seeing them as not as worthy if they weren't a part of the program. And so we had some discussions around, hey, then maybe we could actually reach out to those kids as a group and bring them in as well. So that's kind of what the findings were.
Fantastic. Shelley, can you share what your findings were?
Trauma, and also, oops, let me make sure can you still hear me?
Yeah, I just unmuted you.
Okay, I don't know how that keeps happening. Yeah, so the early trauma, what I found in my results, a lot of my participants came from single parent homes or divorced homes. There was a lot of substance abuse in the family, either through parents and or the students themselves, the participants in my study. There was also domestic violence, sexual assault, and emotional trauma. And so they had a lot of trauma, and all of my participants came from low-income poverty environments. The parents were like working class, and there is poverty. There's a lot of changes that students moved, either moving homes or also moving through different schools. Multiple changes, so the stability was not really strong, and so there was a lot of changes. And so some of my participants, their parents were farm workers, others had very limited education, dropout, never finished high school, low-income status, like I had mentioned. Housekeeper was some of the occupations, being a housekeeper, also working in the factories, and including maintenance men, as far as different the type of employment that some of the participants' parents had. And the transiency, like I said, there's a lot of multiple changes. The other thing that I noticed in my study is that the safety, 3 of my participants were in gangs. Of the 6 participants, 1 was a North Daniel, and then 2 were Piru Bloods. And they joined the gangs, they said, for safety because of their environment, that they needed to, provide for their safety. The other thing that I noticed in K-12 education definitely was of my 6 participants, only 2 kind of came on the radar for looking at giving assessments. One was predominantly Spanish speaker. He didn't get really any help until middle school. So he struggled all through elementary school. And then when he did finally get some of his needs started to be reviewed at middle school, they only tested him in the English. So they didn't even give him a culturally relevant assessment. And he was predominantly Spanish speaking. The other participant, he was in elementary school, and he was going through a lot of domestic violence at home, and the valuation that they did at school was only academics, and so they did like a partial battery. They didn't even look at his social-emotional development and functioning. And so in the data was suggesting that, you know, there was poor assessments, poor resources, and they, like I said, all attended low-income school districts. They basically fell through the cracks. And then 4 of my participants didn't get diagnosed with their disabilities till prison. So they were adults in prison. They finally got diagnosed with their disabilities, and then started getting some services related to their needs actually as adults in prison. So the low-income school districts that they attended didn't really meet their needs. And so, like I said, they fell through the cracks. There was also a lot of discrimination, racism that they experienced in the schools, being called racially charged names. They felt like they were pushed out of the K-12 educational system. One of my participants roamed the halls. He didn't even really go to school. He didn't feel like teachers really connected with him. And so really the school district didn't really kind of pull them in or try to engage them in the K-12 educational system. And so those were some of the kind of findings that I found. Also as related to police. Some of my participants were charged for crimes they didn't even commit as juveniles, and then ended up in the juvenile justice system. And then later, you know, the fractured family unit, they fell victim to, you know, the justice system. And so the overall results of my data. The other thing I want to mention is that 4 of my male participants, all of them were suspended from school. So they had suspensions that didn't really get addressed. There was no behavioral supports that even supported their needs. So a lot of them felt like that, you know, they were getting suspended. One was expelled, but they didn't really have any resources to support the behavioral needs that they were experiencing in the K-12 educational system. And then my 2 female participants, they were not ever expelled or suspended. So the data kind of with the literature with males of color being suspended, my data in my study confirmed that as well. And then the lack of the behavioral supports to help with their behaviors. Let me think other things and look at my notes here. As far as one thing that I also noticed in the study, actually 4 of my participants said they had some good relations with teachers, but 2 definitely did not have positive relationships with their teachers. There's either no relationship, or there was one participant had dislike for teachers, that he just did not have a good experience at all with teachers. But the thing that I noticed that kind of stood out was the negative peers. The participants had talked about what kind of caused them to commit their crimes was their peer group, and the negative peers that they were in their environment that kind of sucked them into getting involved in, you know, committing their crimes, which led to prison. So it was kind of a mixed review on teachers, because like I said, 4 of my participants said they had some good relations and they felt like their teachers were trying to help them. But one of my participants had said that she felt like, because she was in a low-income school district, that the classes were overcrowded and she didn't really get the individual one-on-one help. So that was another way she fell through the cracks, was just not enough resources. And so that's typical of low-income school districts. So that's kind of some of the main findings that I found in my research.
So it seems to me, if I could just summarize a little bit, you know, that there was this sort of complex constellation of factors, that your participants were coming with some, you know, massive traumas of different kinds that they were experiencing, some different environmental stressors, and then you have different things happening in K-12 in terms of discrimination, in terms of disciplinary incidents, and maybe some had relations with teachers and others not. So, and I think that that's, you know, that's an interesting finding in and of itself, right? That there's not necessarily one cause that we can pinpoint from this, that our, you know, our approach has to be multi-layered. So speaking of approaches, my last question then is to both of you. You can talk together. Anyone who wants to can jump in. But based on what you found, what are some of the recommendations that you have for schools, for teachers, for administrators, or any other stakeholders regarding how we can disrupt the criminalization of kids of color in the school to prison pipeline?
I would say that having them build relationships with mentors, people that look like them but have made it. Also supporting families. Involving the parents in the school community is really important, and helping to empower their parents in the system. Often, some of our parents have not had good experiences in school, and so therefore they feel disconnected. So once we start to engage our families and empower them to talk and have a voice, I believe that that is going to be a big change maker for our students, at least those who are with their parents. We have a lot of kiddos who are not even with parents. So figuring out ways to empower those guardians of those students, and also helping to change their own self-perception. Because if they're constantly hearing things like, oh, you're not going to be any good, or they're hearing it just through actions, like we're just sending you out of class, building restorative practices within our systems is really, really important. Closing the loop. If a kid has been sent out, bringing them back and having a conversation about what's taken place. Just those relationship building kind of skills, so that they do feel connected. And sometimes kiddos do, but that might be the one teacher in their 12 years. That might be the two people who really engaged with them. But helping them to build those relationships is really important.
And then there's 3 specific areas that I had for recommendations in my dissertation, looking at full service community schools, not only for the students, but for the families just as a whole, for parents as well, getting resources, whether it's, medical, health, dental resources, counseling, mental health therapists. The full service school communities is an excellent resource. And then also the other thing that I think was significantly huge in my research was looking at trauma-informed pedagogy in the K-12 educational system, because 4 of my participants did not get diagnosed, like I said, till prison, and they were diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. So they all had trauma in their early lives, and it went, untreated. And then finally, when they got to prison, they got diagnosed with the PTSD, and then started getting services and supports. And the last thing is the school-wide restorative justice initiatives. I think definitely involving our law enforcement at the local level with our public schools, providing some alternatives, because these, like as Dr. DiShawn had said, they need mentors. Our students need mentors to work with them and make good choices and see positive, strong role models in their community. And that restorative justice and looking at it as an opportunity to learn rather than something being punitive at a very early level on, that if we can help our students have opportunities to learn from their mistakes, because everybody makes mistakes, and having it where it is helpful and supportive for growth and not punitive. And so I think working with law enforcement to get that message across, that these are communities of students that need extra supports in this area, so we can prevent them from going to the juvenile justice system, and we can prevent them and mitigate them from eventually going to state prison as adults, if we can catch it at a lower level as when they're younger.
Can I get your thoughts on one more thing? So we know that rather than framing it as an individual act, we know people obviously have some individual agency, but the criminalization of kids of color in the school to prison pipeline also comes from really long-standing patterns. And as you were pointing out, Shelley, they encompass much more than just the K-12 environment. It is coming out of poverty. That poverty has been created from historical patterns. We have structures in school. Our teachers come in with deficit mindsets. Do you have ideas on what are some of the things that we can do, maybe in working with teachers or administrators or anyone else, to treat this as a systemic issue and to really disrupt some of these fundamental patterns?
Well, in our district right now, I always say I get to do these things. I get to work on cultural competency. And so we've been doing a lot of training of our principals and then also of our teachers, just about how to connect with people that are not looking like you. We have we have mostly white teachers. That's just across America. And then we have all these diverse kiddos who not everybody is ready to and competent to really address and build these relationships. And what we found is that it's you can train, but then it's also a shift in the hearts and minds of the people in front of children every day. And so there's training, and then there's building empathy, and then there's building relationships. And then, so we're doing all of those things. We've also shifted to restorative practices. And so we're out there training, we're in the schools, we're supporting around those things. And for us, one of the things we just started was our African American Parent Council. So we're actually bringing parents to the table to talk about what is needed for African American kiddos. Like, what is needed? What do we see as our needs? Because we often don't ask the questions that we probably should be asking of our families. Like, we're like, oh, you must need an after school program, or oh, you must, but we don't really address and ask the questions we might need to be asking, and opening up forums for folks to actually express what's going on for their families. So those are some of the things at least we're shifting to.
Shelley, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think the same thing. Definitely the cultural understanding. I think it's really important that the teachers that are hired in these positions definitely try to at least get out of their own skin and see another perspective. Because I think what happens with the conflict, sometimes the cultural clash and the cultural deficit between teachers and the students is, you know, if some of our teachers didn't grow up in some of these neighborhoods where the students are growing up, they don't really have an insight into the economic barriers and challenges that kids come with. And so just little things. I mean, it could be, you know, if a student can't show up to, you know, basketball practice or something because their parents are working late, the sensitivity to allowing, you know, parent or teachers to understand that, you know, parents have these work schedules. And I think that providing alternative opportunities for students to participate in different time frames that work with parents' schedules and work schedules. I think that's really important, that teachers have a mindset of, you know, the differences, I think, in these communities that they may not understand until there is training on that, and that cultural sensitivity. Even when parents come to conferences, you know, teachers, I think it's really important for teachers to be sensitive, because sometimes parents are maybe embarrassed to ask a question, and they want to, you know, they're trying to help their child, but then they, you know, may be embarrassed to ask a question. And I think just having that intuitiveness from a teacher to be able to sense when a parent wants information. And so I think that teachers being able to give that information ahead of time, so then parents don't have to feel uncomfortable or embarrassed to like ask that question. So just the cultural sensitivity to economics, to work, to, you know, just everything. I think just the more knowledge that teachers have for cultural training and sensitivities in all areas, whether it's economic or cultural or related to specific cultural groups, I think that every little bit helps.
Fantastic. Okay, I'm going to thank you both very much. And I am going to go ahead and end the recording, but thank you very much.